Welcome back. We've got a really important conversation today, and thankfully, I've got an amazing human being. Amrita, welcome to the show.
Mike, so good to be here. And like you said, this is a very important conversation.
Yeah, so why don't you share a little bit about you, and then we'll jump right into that very important conversation.
Fantastic. Um, a great way to know, because everyone can look me up and LinkedIn and all the posts. A great way to know who I am is I'm an imperfect human being who has figured out that there is a way around a very important reality of our lives, which is crisis. I teach in University of Pennsylvania and collaborate with the Wharton Executive Education. I work all over the world. I'm a speaker and I'm an author. I don't see these as my badges. I see these as my service to humanity at this point of time. And I think all of us are doing the best that we can. I'm hoping that our conversation today with you, Mike, brings out 2, 3 points that I think would be tremendously critical to the GPS of our times and the leaders who are responsible for it.
Yeah, your work you're doing is critically important, and we'll start off with kind of the framework that we talked a little bit about in the pre-show is the trauma that came and is still around for so many people of what happened with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which was, over 5 years ago now. There's just a lot of people that are still dealing with that in a variety of different ways. And some of it has been, or many of it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think a lot of people have never really properly addressed it. They've just kind of moved on from it and like, okay, we're through that, and they haven't sat with it. They haven't kind of unpacked what that was like, and maybe in little doses, maybe in moments of time. Occasionally I'll think of a situation where if I walk into a grocery store or a restaurant that I was able to visit during that time, sometimes maybe there's some remnants of the QR codes on the table instead of handing you menus, or the barricades in some stores are still up, or you see, maybe a floor sticker that they forgot to remove that says, line up here kind of thing. And it's those little visual reminders to go, oh yeah. I guess sometimes you kind of go through autopilot on things and put it behind us, but I don't think many of us actually kind of sat with it and mourned it, or just kind of, checked in to see, how we feel about all of that. So I know you've done an absolute ton of research on this and would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Mike, allow me to acknowledge what you said, the reality of it. It's like a movie that hasn't stopped, really. It's a television that's still going around, and sometimes it catches us unaware. And for those of us who are more reflective, are in greater grips of our mind rather than gripped by our mind, we are able to acknowledge that 5 years is no time. In fact, the pandemic has accelerated almost all trends. And today we understand that trauma is an experience that is not metabolized. And that's what you're talking about. So just like an indigestion at an intellectual level, at an emotional level, at a spiritual level, at a somatic level. And we have 32 kinds of intelligences. Across all levels, everyone is processing it differently. Some of us at the farthest end are, in ignore and override. We go there. And then there are some who are in adapt and overcome. Why I'm mentioning this? Because you see, something at a scale of a collective trauma that has taken place, and that is my research, that we all suffer in life. The pandemic kind of equalized everyone, and we all suffered differently, but there was an equality in what we faced together across generations, across different levels of equity, across different continents. Now, we know that 100 years ago, humanity had faced a similar crisis. And we know that the viral strain continues, and I'm not using a past tense, continues to evolve even today. We call it under different names of the flu. So what has been in history a matter of 100 years and still going, the pandemic can't just be, something that was tagged and done, and we had a pandemic, hour, if you will, in humanity's history. Crisis has become a huge opportunity for all of us. The reason is, Mike, crisis will not stop. And I'm not being a Debbie Downer. I'm saying this as an awakening to the human intelligence, because either we'll slink into the dark ages or we will turn to Renaissance, and we can take this as the dark ages. With the amount of wars that are going on, with the vicarious trauma that we see from the media flashing at us, one might be right in arguing, where is the hope? What do I look forward to? That is one point of view. And that's a point of view that is sensational, that is dramatic, and useful for a lot of drug companies, if you will, to kind of say, all right, let's just drug the humanity into a state of ease, an uneasy ease, but ease. The second kind of perspective that is developing world over, and many of the intelligent audiences listen to your podcast, is an awareness that we have to pivot how we think, who we think, where we are, and like our iPhones and home styles, upgrade our inner GPSs in the way we think, because there is a lived experience of the pandemic that has taught us that our assumptions of reality are fleeting and fickle. We understand that we can't take life for granted. We understand, and pardon my French, we have just no time for things that fall under the technical term crap. We just don't have time for that. And there is something about valuing the inner core of our lived relationships, about our bodies, about the time we spend. And so qualitatively world over, there is a trending that people are making choices for better life purposes, for the way we are looking at possibilities, the way we are relating, the way we understand personal strengths, and above all else, the way we relate to each other has become critical. And that falls across whether work, home, community, friends. Today, the kinds of choices that are being made are no longer choices that are dictated by convention. And so if we are still thinking in the way of the 1990s and whatever medical schools or MBA schools or military schools we went, none of it works anymore. Trauma makes us humble. Trauma also makes us teachable. The question is, are we learning so that our wisdom prevents the current and the next generation of people from repeating history, because history will sing a similar tune again.
Phrase I like to say is history may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And we see that in, and I've heard many people say this, especially those that have gone through any type of traumatic experience or difficult time, whether it's at home, work, combination thereof, is kind of ask yourself, and it takes strength to do this and understanding about it, but it's like, okay, what is this teaching me? And be open to be taught, because challenges are opportunities. Trauma and traumatic experiences, there are opportunities that come from that. And it's important to recognize that, because, and I'm not diminishing, the trauma or challenges that people face. You see it and hear it all the time. And if you're empathetic like I am, you feel for them, and sometimes you want to put on the cape and save the day kind of thing. And it's like, and if you do that too much, then you're not saving yourself. You got to take care of yourself first. And then when you do have the opportunity to help in any way that you can, well, they're getting a better version of you when you do that. But you're taking care of yourself first, which is what the world needs. We need all of us to take care of ourselves to the best of our abilities, because we all have a role to play in this beautiful planet that we live in, that has all kinds of tragedies and chaos and triumph and everything else. It's life is meant to be lived, and it's not smooth sailing. It can be bumpy, but that's what makes the adventures. That's what refines us. Smooth roads or smooth oceans don't make a good sailor. It's the choppy ones that have made sailors be able to navigate through challenging times. It's if everything's just easy, well then, I think everybody could just go take a nap and we'd wake up and okay, we'll just pick up where we left off. But that's not how things go. And it's important, and I love the work that you've done and do on this, because again, when people have a traumatic experience, whether it's the leveling playing field, and I love how you phrase that, around what COVID did, because we were all in the same boat. I think for a moment in time, I think the globe was more unified per se than they've ever been, because we were all kind of in the same situation. And, you know, I look at that in many ways as a lost opportunity. And I think we could have, as a collective, really taken advantage of that. But I think we were so worried and focusing on this virus that was killing a bunch of people, that we didn't take the time to go, okay, how can we better relate with each other? How do we better connect? How do we better live, from a global perspective and a connectivity perspective? But I think that was a missed opportunity that too many of us didn't take advantage of.
Well, you know, Mike, there are so many significant insights that you shared, and I'm appreciative of this. I'm going to bring up something that you mentioned about, the missed opportunity of the pandemic. And I will offer that something has happened, altered, perhaps is not in the forefront of the neocortex and is guiding us every day, but it's happening at the back, at the hippocampus. You see, all of humanity, if I look at all of us, and for a while, going with what you said, this beautiful pale blue dot that we exist in the quantum physics of the universe. If we look at our planet and look at all species, and we are one of the billion species that are on this planet, one of the things that is incredibly important to understand is that death, the mortality, is one of the primary reasons of the survival instinct. And collectively, as a humanity, that was challenged. Now, that's an obvious fact. Now, what is not so obvious is how we deal with it. As technology improves and quality of life improves, we understand death to be a farther and farther and farther away from our consciousness. In the animal world, it's an ever clear present danger. The alertness is never reduced. However, in humanity, we have done extremely well in the planet at the cost sometimes of other species. But what has happened to us is that death is not front and center. It is something that happens eventually, is considered to be in the category of great misfortune. But when that challenge is presented, when our mortality brings out how fragile, how vulnerable we are to this eternal truth, and taxes and poetry are the other two things, when that inevitable comes forward, we have two ways of addressing it. We can deny it, which is the most common way of responding to it. And I think the entire humanity is in denial of what really happened. And the second thing is, after denial, and maybe, this is the human time, the outside time and the inner time. And the second thing that happens is growth from it. Because whether we know it or not, we are growing. The question is that a good growth, a helpful growth? As you said, am I a better version? Or is that a growth that is perverted and twisted and negative and will only cause the fall of everyone around us, like a black hole? Either we eat it up or we become the place where new growth takes place. So my focus is on the question of life force. The pandemic challenged it, and the nature of crisis was such that everyone across felt the suffering. And if they were fortunate enough to not suffer as much, they witnessed the millions of people suffering thanks to technology. And one of the things that happened is that the whole world split itself into four categories. The first category was those who went into the deepest end of the shock, which we understand to be PTS, and further, that required immediate long-term care. It's not just the veterans, it's not just the people who go through violence at home. This was a huge emotional warfare on all of us. So some of us went to the farthest end from where we have not retreated. In fact, we've become hermits to that pain. Yes, that is a sort of a complete imprisonment of that. Now, let me establish the opposite spectrum. The opposite spectrum were those who understood that we were in crisis. They upgraded their thinking. Every invention was to upgrade the inner GPS, which looked at the relationship between self, others, and the place in the world. That GPS moved up in such a way that they became magnets. It's not that they didn't suffer. Instead of just focused on self-absorbed suffering, they ensured that they respected their lives more, they respected others more, and they respected the place that they were awake in the world where millions were not waking up. So with these two continuums established firmly, my research also pulled up the fact that two other categories came in the middle. One was people who started becoming interpreters of others, such as people who make sense through conversations with other peoples. Uh, these are the interpreters. You see, the interpreters are people who ask the most critical questions, sometimes making sense for themselves while helping the whole world make sense. So this falls strictly in the category of interpreters. And they have different roles. There are also people who do not take credit for the wisdom that comes out as a result of this spontaneous interpretation. And the second bit that comes are the people who are in the pendulum area. Sometimes they are able to see sense, and sometimes the pendulum goes back to the catastrophe that the pandemic really is and was. The reason I mention all of this is in the research, I had the joy of speaking with 30 people who Mike would never call themselves heroes, never. But they were moms and dads. They were people, extraordinary people, who statistically you would deem ordinary. And therefore, I'm kind of on a war cry saying, delete the word normal. Because these people who would say, I'm a regular guy, I'm a regular girl. But what happened is I met extraordinary people all over the world, across 12 countries. They spoke 16 languages, practiced different faiths, 22 occupations, 71% of them had masters and above. So a very intelligent group of people. And they told their stories about how the pandemic continued as a weather because nothing stopped. Deaths happened, so funerals happened, weddings happened, so weddings happened, graduation happened, births happened, celebrations happened. All of this happened while the world continued to be in a lockdown. And so the insight that came out of this is that whether the crisis is intended or unintended, whether it is the instrument of nature, instrument of us, human made, or it is AI, the question is very, very simple. As a result of the crisis, post-traumatic growth is both a process and an outcome. Am I increasing the amplification of my effectiveness to myself, so my relationship with myself, my relationship with others, in the periphery of the network of trust? How do I trust and who do I trust? And third, what is my place in the world? And am I living a life that is worth living? I'll pause there because what is coming out of this is every bit of reinvention and metamorphosis that has taken place at this end. And when I'm saying this end, I'm, for the audio listeners, I'm pointing out the right side of the equation where people have become magnets of growth through the suffering. And then there are those who are stuck in the black hole of growth, which is everything gets eaten up and annihilated. Both are real in their own place. So it cannot be that one is good or one is bad. I think duality doesn't exist anymore. And that's the paradox of our time. Every choice is a magnet for consequences, whether those choices are for ourselves, whether those choices are for others or for the world. So the question to consider is, what kind of choices are we making in face of crisis when we need to be our most mature? I'll pause there.
So much to unpack there. One of the things that jumped out at me right away is, and you just said it, the choices that we make, and some of the choices will, all of our choices set us down a path. It may be a continuation of a path that we're already on, or it could be a U-turn or a slight veering to the left or the right or things. But I see, and this is not a blanket statement by any stretch, but I see a lot of people that will make choices that end up creating so much chaos in the world for them and those around them. And it's like when we make a choice, as you just mentioned, that impacts usually more than just us. Even if it's a simple choice, sometimes it has a ripple effect on what it could do for others. And it's just one of those things where I think, um, you know, if you're having a difficult time and you're dealing with trauma and all this stuff, you end up harming yourself in many ways by the choices you continue to make that just make the situation to the point where you're going through a challenging situation to all out chaos. And obviously I want you to respond to that, but also kind of highlight the your feelings and your thoughts and your research on chaos, because when you hear the word chaos, you think, unless you're really old and you remember the Maxwell Smart series and Agent Chaos and all of that kind of stuff. I haven't seen that stuff in a long time. I kind of go want to watch that again. I'm sure one of the streaming services carries it. But chaos, people think about that and they think, it's one of those words that describes itself. It's like, what's chaos? What's chaos? It's like, no, we've got to unpack that a little bit more. But it's one of those things where I see time and time again, people will make some decisions that launch them into that. And when we think of chaos, we think it's just completely everything's out of sorts. But one of the things that you mentioned in the pre-show that we want to flush out as well is, there's a map basically of chaos. You think it's just completely scattered, like you take something, you throw it against the wall, and it goes everywhere. It's like, no, there's a methodology to it. And but yeah, I want to hear your thoughts on that, and obviously finish your point is what we were talking about before.
Mike, like you said, chaos is inevitable. The first thing to realize is that chaos is not something that happens. Chaos is, most of the time, the usual state. We have bounded rationality. We look at the world with limited windows and we say, okay, anything out of my window of sanity is insanity, and chaos is, of course, insanity. So in 1970s, and that'll get a chuckle out of all the listeners and you, Mike, is that there was an American pragmatist and a futurist by the name of Alvin Toffler, and he said, the illiterate of the 21st or the 22nd century won't be the ones who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And one of the things that happens in chaos, and I will go to chaos, but through the path of complexity. Now, complexity science is a way of thinking. And one of the most beautiful things about complexity science is that it allows you to understand the patterns of thought, which is patterns of choices. But here, choices with consequences. Like you said, it can lead us into chaos. So what is complexity? So on the left and right hand, if you mention two axes, the one is on what do we do? The second is how do we do what we need to do? And when we are in consensus, we say, oh, we both agree that this is what we do and this is how to do it. And then eventually, as things get more complicated, the consensus reduces. You might have a certain point of view, I might have a certain point of view. And in a democratic setup of our thinking, whether it's inner democracy or outer democracy, we end up asking, okay, so what's the sensible point of disagreement, if you will? And so, okay, we can do this much and this is the how. But there comes a point where there is no consensus, such as how much do we trust AI? Question. How much do we trust the evolving geopolitical tensions that we are noticing in the world? Because our children are asking those questions. Our young leaders are asking our questions. The CEOs are asking, the leaders of the nations. So this is the unifying question that you asked, Mike. So when we say that, okay, we are at a point where there is very little consensus on what to do and how to do, that, according to complexity thinking, leads us to chaos, a total absence of consensus. That is chaos, when we can't agree on what to do and how to do. And then we say, oh, it's scattered all over. But here's the funny thing. Chaos is not confusion in face of absence of consensus. Chaos is absence of focus in confusion. And where does the focus come from? In understanding that our GPSs should tell us, and it goes back to what you had said right at the beginning, we need to take care of ourselves, because if an insane instrument will create insane chaos, but a sane instrument will figure the way, the point, the path out of the chaos to a new order. Disorder to order has been a history of humanity. It is the history of discovery. It is the history of innovation and invention. It is the reason why technology is at the place it is today. As humanity, we are at the best possible age today. And how is it possible we are coexisting with the worst possible geopolitical chaos today? Right? So much sense and so much that is senseless coexisting together. This is the paradox of our generation. And that's why right at the beginning, I said, either this is leading us to a renaissance of our times, or this is going to lead us to the very dark ages one more time. The question is, what are the kind of choices we're making? Because you see, choice is the easy part to know, okay, what to do and how to do it. It sounds pretty simple, Dr. A, but not really. Unless we are thinking through the consequences of our choices, intended and unintended. And that requires, Mike, what you and I were talking pre-show as well about the kind of conversations you have. is the humility is the most important thing necessary in chaos. Humility, where my ego, so say I'm the head of the nation, I'm the head of the organization, I'm the head of the family, I am the head of my friends group, yes, whether I'm a teenager or I'm a leader of the nation. Across all, I will every time have a micro and a macro choice. The question is, am I making a choice that makes me a better human being, like you said, to those around me and makes the situation better? Or am I truly leading to a total disorder and mayhem? And why am I saying that? There takes no talent to lead anyone or anything or any nation into the black hole. It requires zero talent. An extremely untalented personality can lead us to absolute chaos. But it takes exceptionally talented people to recreate out of chaos. I am not interested in the doom and gloom of the chaos because, one simply has to look at the human history to know we are fantastic at creating destruction and chaos. We have that talent. What I'm saying is our generation and onwards could choose better, focused effort and struggle. And I'm mentioning the struggle in the most respectful way possible. You see, we are slaves to our experience of successes and failures. And unfortunately, that handcuffs us because we become arrogant because we are modeled on a society of meritocracy and competence. And competence comes from what I've done in my past. Unfortunately, that data is useless when our assumptions get shattered by the crisis, which flips the script on all that we know. And that's the time one has to go down on one's knees and say, all right, I accept my experience, my education, my wins, my laurels, my repute. Nothing gives me an answer to this, which means I have to start asking basic questions. What can I do? How does this impact me, others, the world? How much of it is real? What do I not control? What can I influence? You see, these 5 questions, whether it is an earthquake in our personal lives, or an earthquake geopolitically, or an earthquake in our nation and countries, or an earthquake in our relational trust, all of that can be taken with these 5 questions asked slowly, asked carefully. And what you were saying, Mike, none of us really have had a sit down with ourselves and said, who have I become as a consequence of the pandemic? Because we are created, human life is created, and we know this by the forces of culture, biology, psychology, and history. So we are not oversimplified variables in the game. We also don't want to be collateral damage to the propaganda or fear or whatever that the black hole naturally creates by nature of it. It requires tremendous humility to say, what I have known may not be helpful in this point. So I have to learn again, unlearn a lot of things, and relearn the nature of choices I must make for the highest good of the collective, others, and self.
So important, and learning and relearning and unlearning is something that everyone needs to focus. And many times, and I saw this, I don't think it was in an audio book I was listening to not too long ago. Our egos can be problematic, and I'm saying that lightly. It can be really problematic for some of us, and in many situations, we basically need to relocate our egos sometimes down to the empty corner house down the end of the street for a bit. It's like, I need you to stay there, because as you mentioned too, humility and being humble, especially in the middle of chaos. You see people that are just running around and they're, doing the sky is falling and everything's going to fall apart. And this is going to be the worst thing in the history of everything. Where the ones that are calm and they're observing and they're just taking whatever information that they have accessible, making the best choices, but using those 5 questions. And I know some people, they may even have a sheet. They're like, okay, let's go through the 5 questions, whatever makes sense for you. Surgeons use checklists. I'm really thankful they do, because they're, it's cut down on a lot of surgical mistakes over the years. But in leadership decisions and choices in life, and say, okay, what's my role in this? If I make this choice, who does it impact besides me? When you go through those exercises, I think it again, it provides some organization to the chaos. Like, okay, let's I see this for what it is. And as hard as it is to take the emotion out of it, because we're emotional creatures, by removing that as much as we can to get us some clarity and, being okay with sitting with the I don't know. And a lot of people, they're not comfortable with I don't know, which in a way is kind of ironic because when we were first growing up and learning new things, we didn't know, but that didn't bother us. We wanted to know, but we weren't held back like, well, I don't know that. It's like, well, then learn
Mhm.
it.
Mm.
YouTube University, folks, you can learn pretty much. Now, it doesn't mean what you're learning is correct, but at least you've got an avenue to learn how to do things that are better understand and get, different perspectives. So, love to
Mhm.
hear your thoughts on that real quick because, we're coming up at the end of it. I knew this was going to be a longer one, and I'm thankful that I was right because I'm having fun with this, and I could probably talk with you for days on this. But I would love to hear, some of your thoughts on that before we wrap up.
Well, since we are in the moment of wrapping up, allow me to acknowledge what you so beautifully said. Curiosity is the superpower we're born with. But along the way, in the adulting of life, we are taught that no, we don't need to be curious anymore, and you just know things. And unfortunately, the programming in the society is a sort of an arrogance about knowing things. You get promoted because of this, you get rewarded because of this. So, our egos are well programmed, quite like the Pavlov, that, I must pretend to be a little more arrogant than I really feel. And confidence is the number one thing we look in for people. I think in times of crisis, it has to be reverse, like you said, going to the calm and the observant. The second thing to consider very, very carefully is what happens if we are unaware and blindsided by the need of our denials. It is important to understand that we are denying a few things. And denying an override is simply kicking the can down. If one has to slay the dragons will be waiting for a while before the dragons come and take control. So the question is this: are you in charge of the fluid situation of crisis, or is the crisis making you a puppet out of it? Where is the location? And the reason I am focusing on that is because as adults, and I'm talking to all the leaders of the whole world and every listener that listens, the job of the leader is not sometimes just to lead, but also to awaken wisdom. You see, the generation that is coming up, they are gaining knowledge faster than attaining wisdom. So we know a lot of things. The question is, are we applying it, as you said, in the right places that lead to the highest good possible within the constraints of the situation? You see, in crisis, we need to be our most mature self. And in crisis, the nature of human mind and fear, because we are emotional creatures, as you mentioned, is to regress to default behaviors. Now, we must fathom that in our algorithm of response to crisis. We know fear paralyzes us. And as of now, the entire society is in a state of knowledge paralysis because of overload of information. So the only key out of this is not attention, but what we are attentive to. So my question is, put aside the guilt. Guilt is a psychological meal that makes us slow. Put aside guilt, put aside shame, and ask yourself the simple question. Everyone on this planet, most of us, are good people. They deserve good things. They deserve to live in a world that is beautiful, meaningful, and sensible. Our children deserve to believe that life will have something good for them, and not just wars, not just scarcities, not just famine of human values and ethical systems. If we are to create this outcome for our next generation, because really that's the only job we have, is to create the way for the next generations who are coming up and be the generation that made those choices. So the leaders have to ask, how do we ensure that there is plenty of wisdom around, beginning with something so simple as, what's the choice I'm making? Because if I'm making choices based on fear, then I'm only leading towards the black hole. There is no way out of the contagion. We got out of a contagion of a virus. We cannot get out of the contagion of fear. Fear by itself is a teacher with fierce lessons to teach. If we respect that, then we can get to the point where growth is inevitable. Growth beyond crisis is inevitable. And that's the generation we want to be. pandemic generation could be the generation that taught all other generations coming after us how to live with dignity, civility, honor, and decency. Simple things, all coming out of one thing: the choices we make when everything is unknown.
Good friend of mine named Mark likes to say tragedy creates opportunity, and we're all sitting on a very important opportunity. So, Amrita, love this conversation. Where can people find out more about you and all this amazing work you're doing?
Absolutely. Growbeyondpain.com is the place you can flock to for a lot of research. It is one place where I'm consolidating almost everything. You could also follow me on LinkedIn with my full name. And also, please go ahead and investigate. I am invoking the Sherlock Holmes in all the thinkers. Go ahead and investigate very gently, very affectionately, and very respectfully the way you are living your life. Going back to what Mike, you said, we have only one business: living, and living well. And if we do that, it all begins with a simple question: with all that is unknown, are we making choices that make life better for everyone, including us?
You're here. Love that. So definitely have that information in the show notes. So thank you again for your time. Like I said, I could talk to you for days on this. So really appreciate your time today. And thanks again for being on the show.
You bet, Mike. This was fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity of speaking to your wonderful people.
Thank you.